Okay. So yesterday we studied the characteristics of medieval philosophy. Just to give you a brief recap, we wanted to understand what were the major themes of medieval philosophy. So if you remember, we studied how medieval philosophy, medieval Western philosophy, was essentially the study of concepts like God, the existence of God, the how God interacts with the world, and the arguments for for God's existence. And these were the major themes of medieval philosophy. We know that medieval philosophy developed after the fall of the pagan Roman civilization and after the emergence of the Christian world, the Western Christian world. So the Roman civilization adopted Christianity completely. They became a Christian empire. After the advent of Isa alayhi salam, they adopted Christianity as their state religion, and Christianity spread throughout Europe, throughout even the northern part of Middle East, North Africa, and other areas. And it was there where in places like Egypt, in places like Rome and neighboring areas where and Europe, obviously, where medieval philosophy was developed. And the main themes of medieval philosophy were to understand God, the concept of revelation, through the lens of Aristotelian philosophy. So they developed Christian theology at that time was developed, and it was done primarily by viewing and interpreting the Bible, which is a religious text, obviously, through using rational methods, using Aristotle's philosophy, the Aristotelian methods, the dialectical method. So today, moving on now, we want to study one of the most important thinkers of medieval Western philosophy. We also, if you remember, we also talked about how Muslims also developed great philosophy at that time, the medieval Eastern, it could be called the medieval Eastern philosophy. And much of the Western philosophy at that time was also influenced by Muslim works. But our concept, the themes that we have to study, firstly, is Augustine, and then inshallah we'll be studying Thomas Aquinas. Let me see. Now let's go into who Augustine was. As we saw, he's also known as Saint Augustine because most of the philosophers, most of the medieval philosophers were also religious scholars. They were extremely religious people, and they were called saints. So what is a saint? We all know, as we have in our own tradition as well, wali jisko bolte hain, ya peer, like a very, very holy person. So Saint Augustine, that's how he's called. Let's go into who he was, and हमारे syllabus में it's just his epistemology that we have to study. Now, epistemology, if you remember in your first class, we studied the branches of knowledge, the branches of philosophy, and one of the most important branches of philosophy, one of the most important branches of philosophy is epistemology. And epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's the philosophy of knowledge, to study the sources and the methods, the validity of knowledge. Okay, so we're going to go into the epistemology of Augustine, but let's just get an introduction into who Augustine was. So Augustine is a 4th century philosopher who infused his Christian religious doctrine with Plato and Neoplatonism. Now, we did understand that medieval philosophy, the period usually that's given for medieval philosophy is 5th century Common Era to 15th century Common Era. But here we know that Augustine came a little bit before 5th century. He came from 4th century, but this is 4th century Common Era. do make a note of that. CE, 4th century CE, that's his time. So he infused Christian religious doctrine with Plato and Neoplatonism. We studied in our previous class how Plato, everyone knows who Plato is, but we hadn't gotten, familiarity with Neoplatonism. But we did study Plotinus. If you remember, I told you about this guy called Plotinus, who was a very famous philosopher. He was very much influenced by Plato. Plotinus was very much influenced by Plato. तो ये जो movement है, इसका नाम रखा जाता है Neoplatonism, is a movement based on the writings of Plotinus. Okay, you can write that. Neoplatonism is a philosophical movement based on the writings and the views of Plotinus, 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 right? A very important figure from, in Western philosophy. He himself was influenced by Plato. Now, let's go back to Augustine. He's also famous for his contributions to Western philosophy, along with Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. So, Augustine is very famous. He's a very famous, very important philosopher from the Western tradition. Okay. Now, we don't have to go into much detail. We just want a basic view of who he was, what his philosophy was all about. Utna to matlab, it should be clear to everyone that his philosophy was the mixing or the merger of Christian religious doctrine with Plato's philosophy and Neoplatonism or Plotinus's philosophy. प्लेटो और प्लोटाइनस से बहुत ज्यादा ये इन्फ्लुएंस था ऑगस्टीन जो था, ठीक है? अच्छा, now as we saw, he was born in North Africa. So उस वक्त Roman Empire had spread out in many directions, not just in Europe. It had come to North Africa as well and many parts of Middle East as well. So he was one of the key figures in the transition from classical antiquity to the Middle Ages. तो हमने कहा जो medieval period की philosophy थी वो एक transition है. The medieval philosophy is a transition from the classical period. Classical matlab ancient period. जो ancient period was Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, जो हमने पढ़े. From the ancient period to the Middle Ages. So Augustine started that movement. Movement of what? Transition from the classical antiquity, matlab the ancient philosophy, to Middle Ages or medieval philosophy. So he lived nearly 80 years of the social transformation, political upheavals, military disasters, and decline of the Roman Empire. So this is something that we studied yesterday, that it was medieval philosophy actually came up only after the decline of the Roman Empire. Only after the decline of the Roman Empire. And the Christianization of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire was increasingly becoming Christian. Now, Augustine was a confirmed Manichaean. Okay, you don't have to go into that. Okay. Now, this is one of his famous books, Confessions. So you can write one of his famous works, one of Augustine's famous works is called Confessions. Okay, Confessions. So he was the bishop of Hippo. So as we said, he was a religious scholar. So he was a bishop of this place called Hippo. So many a times he's called Augustine of Hippo. So you shouldn't get confused. It's the same person, Saint Augustine of Hippo. That's a place in Algeria, modern Algeria. Algeria is in North Africa, right? Okay. And he devoted the remaining decades of his life to the formation of an ascetic religious community. Like we said, he was extremely religious and he was also the head of an ascetic religious community. Ascetic matlab जो ये होते हैं ना बिल्कुल जो renounce करते हैं all worldly pleasures. So basically, the kind of yogi Indian philosophy में, या जैसे Sufi Islamic philosophy में, the people who are extremely, they renounce worldly pleasures. So he was a head of one of such communities. Now let's go to our actual topic. We want to study his epistemology, or his philosophy of knowledge. Now, Augustine time and again attacks the skeptic thesis that a high degree of probability is the most that the human mind can attain. Now, skepticism jo hai, it's a view. You can write skepticism is a view that absolute knowledge about the world is impossible. Absolute knowledge about the world is impossible. तो वो skepticism एक view है कि मतलब दुनिया के बारे में हमें knowledge नहीं मिल सकती है. At the most थोड़ी सी probability वाली knowledge मिल जाए, मगर actual knowledge, absolute knowledge मिलना नामुमकिन है. तो Augustine जो है, he attacks that philosophy. This view of skepticism, which is that a high degree of probability is the most that the human mind can attain. जो ये skeptic thesis थी, जो skeptic philosophy थी, वो बोलती थी कि मतलब at the most हमें क्या मिल सकता है? बस high probability. उससे ज्यादा कुछ नहीं मिल सकता है. You cannot get absolute knowledge about the world. Human mind में वो capacity ही नहीं है to get absolute knowledge about the world. But Augustine says this is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. That means we can get knowledge about the world and absolute knowledge about the world. So he refutes this thesis in his book, this one, Contra Academicos. He refutes this book. Who's this now? Yeah, he refutes this view in his book Contra Academicos, saying that a man can attain certain knowledge. That means Augustine believes that we can get certain knowledge with certainty, knowledge that has certainty. यकीन जिसमें होगा वो वाला इल्म इंसान को मिल सकता है. ये है ऑगस्टीन का व्यू कि इंसान को यकीन का इल्म मिल सकता है. So this is very important. This is extremely important that you understand. इसका epistemology में main चीज है. आप ये चैटिंग में सिर्फ लिखेंगे तो पढ़ेंगे क्या? Why don't you keep quiet? You just keep chatting on WhatsApp. आप पढ़ रहे हैं या chat कर रहे हैं? Anyways, literally, I've never seen this in any class. I teach 4 classes. कोई इस तरह बातें नहीं करता है. आप लोग सिर्फ WhatsApp पे chatting करनी है तो करिए chat. Anyways, moving on. In this reply to the question of skepticism, how do you know that this world even exists if the senses are mistaken? He answers, even if he's asleep and dreaming, he can refer to the world, so understand and say without chance of error that either it is one or it is not. मतलब जो skeptic थे ये बोलते थे आपको knowledge ही नहीं मिल सकती है दुनिया की. You cannot get knowledge about the world. So he says that even अगर इंसान सोया भी होता है और इंसान ख्वाब भी देख रहा है, तब भी इंसान को इतना तो पता है कि it's me who's having the dream. It's me who's having this dream. If I am mistaken, I exist. मतलब even if I'm getting an error about, if I'm getting wrong information, my senses are being misled, but I know that it's me who's being misled. So let me say that again. Let me read this again. This will make things clear. In his reply to the question of skepticism, how do you know that this world even exists if the senses are mistaken? तो जो ये स्केप्टिक थे, ये क्यों डिनाई करते थे नॉलेज ऑफ द वर्ल्ड? क्योंकि ये कहते थे भाई सेंसेस जो हैं दे आर मिस्टेकन. Senses can be mistaken. I'll give you an example. That mirage, you're driving on the road, it's very sunny, you actually see as if there's water on the road, है ना? मिराज जो होता है, सैराब जो होता है, और there's no water. There's absolutely no water, but you actually see as if there's water on the road. So that is an optical illusion. Or many a times, you can do this. You take some object, you take an object like a scale or anything, you dip it in water, it appears bent. It appears bent. That's an optical illusion. वो टेढ़ी लगती है. वो क्यों लगती है टेढ़ी? वो क्यों लगती है टेढ़ी? क्योंकि रिफ्रैक्शन होती है ना, light bends, so we feel even the scale or the stick is bent. So this is an optical illusion. This is an optical illusion. So that means जो skeptics थे वो बोलते थे क्योंकि senses can be fooled, senses can be fooled so much, then how can we even trust the senses? That means हमें knowledge मिल ही नहीं सकती है दुनिया की क्योंकि senses can be fooled. There is no knowledge which is possible about the world because we can be fooled, our senses can be fooled. This was skepticism. तो आप लिख सकते हैं अपने notes में, skepticism believed that since our senses can be fooled or misled, our senses can be misled, comma, therefore knowledge about the world, certain knowledge, मतलब यकीन वाली knowledge, certain knowledge about the world, certain knowledge, मतलब यकीन का इल्म, knowledge about the world is impossible. So ये जो skeptics थे, ये कहते थे कि क्योंकि our senses can be fooled, so the certain knowledge जो है, जो यकीन है, वो हमें कभी मिल ही नहीं सकता है. क्योंकि हमारी senses, how do we know जो हम देख रहे हैं वो सही है या नहीं? How do we know जो हम दुनिया को देख रहे हैं, maybe ये भी एक किस्म का illusion है. How do we know this, whatever we are experiencing in the world, it could be another grand illusion. So that was the view of the skeptics. Now, because Augustine was a religious man, and within the Bible, if we are all aware, it's part of the Abrahamic tradition, this view is not accepted. This view of skepticism is not accepted because the world is considered real. The world, according to religious traditions, like Christian tradition, to Augustine to Christian था, he considered the world to be real. अगर world real है, तो knowledge about the world भी real है. Knowledge about the world भी real है, according to him. So, अब ये इनको कैसे जवाब देता है? How does he answer these skeptics who say that how do you know that this world even exists if the senses are mistaken? Augustine answers, even if he is asleep and dreaming, he can refer to the world, so understand and say without a chance of error that either it is one or it is not, by which he means even if it is true that I am mistaken about nearly everything that I suppose to be true, he argued one inescapable truth will remain, that if I am mistaken, I exist. मतलब, let me get into what it means. कि इसे बोला जाता है, the skeptics say, कि how do you know the world exists if the senses are mistaken? आप देखो कितनी चीजें optical illusions हमें होते हैं. We understand things which wrongly because of our senses. Our senses don't give us true knowledge. So Augustine, tell us, how do you know that the world exists if the senses are mistaken, if we are misled by our senses? So Augustine उस पे reply करता है कि let's say, okay, let me go with your argument. Let's say that I am mistaken about everything. I am mistaken about everything. I have a wrong view about the world completely. I am mistaken about everything. I have a wrong view about everything completely. But एक जो fact है, one escapable truth, one fact remains that it is me. It is me who is mistaken. If I am mistaken, at least I can be sure of the fact that I exist. उसमें कोई doubt नहीं है. हो सकता है, चलो ठीक है, let me go with your argument कि everything else in the world I could be wrong about. He's telling the skeptics. It could be that I am wrong about everything in the world. मगर इतना तो sure है कि it is me who is wrong. It is me who is mistaken. That means at least I know that I exist. Okay? So ये अब आगे जाके आप डेकार्ट अगर आपके सिलेबस में होगा वो भी पढ़ेंगे. डेकार्ट said the same thing. Or Ibn Sina, if you are aware of, Ibn Sina is a very important Muslim philosopher. He also argued in the same way. This is a very important argument for the existence of the human self. कि मतलब अगर इंसान सब कुछ भी डाउट करेगा, okay, let's say I doubt the whole world, पूरा वर्ल्ड एक ख्वाब है, पूरी दुनिया एक मिराज है, it's an illusion. मगर इतना तो मैं नहीं डाउट कर सकती हूँ ना कि मैं ही हूं जो डाउट कर रही हूँ. I am the one who's doubting. That means I exist. I exist. So there is truth about my existence. Okay? So what you can say, let's just finish this and your class will be over, inshallah. This is a very important thing. ये आना चाहिए, फिर बाकी आगे वाला सारा आसानी से आ जाएगा. ये आप लिखिए कि Augustine, up here the skeptics would argue with Augustine that the skeptics, SCEPTICS, the skeptics would argue with Augustine that how can you be sure about the world? How can you be sure? How can you be sure about the world's existence? How can you be sure about the world's existence if the senses are mistaken? If the senses are mistaken. Full stop. उसमें आप लिखेंगे, मतलब ये skeptics का question होता था उसके Augustine को कि how can you be sure about the world? अगर senses गलत है तो आप कैसे बोल सकते हो कि the world is real? How can you be sure about the world's existence? How can you be sure about the world's reality if the senses are mistaken? So, इस पे आप लिखेंगे, Augustine would answer that even if I would be mistaken, even if I would be mistaken about everything, even if I would be mistaken about everything that I suppose to be true. मतलब अगर पूरी दुनिया एक illusion है, I think the world is true, I think the world is real, but let's say पूरी दुनिया अब एक illusion है, I was wrong about the world. So even if I am mistaken about everything that I suppose to be true, comma, but still one inescapable truth, but still one inescapable truth, but still one inescapable truth and fact. मतलब एक कतई ट्रूथ जो कि खत्म नहीं हो, जो एस्केप नहीं कर सकता है, जो हमेशा हमारे साथ रहेगा, और फैक्ट जो रहेगा, one inescapable truth and fact will remain, which is, आप ये बड़ा बड़ा कैपिटल में लिखेंगे so that you remember this, ये वाला, if I am mistaken, I exist. If I am mistaken, I exist. If I'm mistaken, I exist. ठीक है? Okay, we're done almost. And now you can go, and inshallah tomorrow we will go into much detail. We'll complete this epistemology ski. ठीक है ना? All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good day. How do you close this?